Alright, hey guys, welcome to my second lecture for US history. Um, Last time we talked about the Progressive Era, which also happened to be from 1900 to 1920, which is the same time period we're going to talk about today. But we're talking about something completely different today, which is the Great War in America. The Great War, probably more commonly known as World War I, was definitely impactful for America, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So, before we get into the war, we really need to look at America and its relationship to other global nations. So, we got President Theodore Roosevelt, who actually split up nations into civilized and uncivilized nations. Hi, Lucas. And so, anyway, so what he did was he pretty much said that any country that is westernized is considered to be civilized, and any nation that isn't westernized is uncivilized. So to be more specific, he considered the US to be a civilized nation and the Latin American nations to be uncivilized. So he said that civilized nations could intervene in these uncivilized nations. So with his definitions in mind, he's saying that America had full rights to intervene in Latin America nations. Alright, and then we got Japan and Russia fighting in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, and this was a pretty big victory for Japan. They pretty much humiliated Russia with their superior navy, and with Japan's victory, no one really expected Japan to win because they aren't this major European power, or they weren't before. So no one really expected Japan to win, but as soon as Japan is able to defeat Russia, which is a growing European power, Japan definitely rises to the ranks, and other European countries see Japan as a rivaling nation. So here's a political cartoon with the Tsar of Russia during this time. We see here it says prestige on the hourglass. So the Tsar is looking at his Russian prestige kind of wearing away as he loses to Japan. So Japan secretly asks Theodore Roosevelt to help reach this peace agreement in the war, and President Roosevelt is gladly willing to do so, and he wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906, becoming the first U.S. president to win this prestigious award. In 1906, something happens in San Francisco. So the San Francisco school board begins to segregate Asian students, much like how American schools were segregating white students from African American students. But this angered the Japanese government because the U.S. would be segregating between whites and Asians, so tensions definitely arose. And what happened was Theodore Roosevelt and Japan reached this gentleman's agreement. This isn't a real law where it was written anywhere, but it was an agreement created by the leaders of both nations where Japan would stop immigrants from coming to U.S. by withholding passports. So it was just an unofficial agreement where Japan would agree to kind of curtail immigrants so that this wouldn't be a problem anymore. And this is definitely another example of nativism. Then we got something called the Roosevelt Corollary, which he added to the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine is just something that states that European countries cannot intervene in the Western Hemisphere. And Roosevelt was actually afraid that European countries would begin intervening with Latin American nations because European powers such as Germany and Britain have a lot of money owed to them by Latin American countries. And Theodore Roosevelt did not want these European powers getting involved with the Western Hemisphere. So in response, he creates the Roosevelt Corollary, where he says that in future financial instances, the U.S. would intervene and pay off the debts of the Latin America countries. And doing so, the U.S. kind of becomes this police force in Latin America, and this causes a few problems. So here's a political cartoon where Theodore Roosevelt, he's on the U.S. Navy with his giant cannon pointed towards a European king, and that says Monroe Doctrine on it. And that European power is trying to collect this debt from the Latin America colony of Republic of Santo Domingo. And the cartoon is just saying that now with Roosevelt's corollary, he will no longer allow these European powers to kind of interfere with Latin America. All right. So what was the impact of the corollary? The U.S. definitely becomes more involved in Latin America, and like I said, becomes kind of this police force. And there is definitely resentment from many in the Latin America countries, as they did not want America to be kind of meddling in with their affairs. They really wanted to be independent. Next, we have the Panama Canal. The canal was very vital to U.S. interests because it would cut down travel time for shipping. And so the U.S. was able to create something called the Hay-Ponce-Fote Treaty of 1901, which gave the U.S. right to build the canal and right to fortify it. However, the problem was Colombia, which controlled Panama back then. Panama was not an independent nation. It was a territory controlled by Colombia. But Colombia rejected the treaty to give the U.S. the right to build the canal. So what happened was, this is kind of funny. In November 3rd, 1901, a rebellion starts in Panama. And basically, in order to overcome this obstacle of Colombia, what the U.S. does is they instigate a rebellion in Panama to rebel against Colombia, become independent, so that Colombia will no longer pose an issue to the U.S. and they could build the Panama Canal. So here's TR. During construction, he would sometimes come and oversee construction of the canal. Then we have President Taft's foreign policy, which is called dollar diplomacy, and he would have Wall Street bankers encourage Wall Street bankers to invest in areas of strategic concern to the U.S. He would help other countries while making money for the U.S. And then we have the conflict of President Wilson and Mexico. So the U.S. definitely had their eyes on gaining territory or putting influence in Mexico because there was definitely financial interest in Mexico for the U.S. And what was happening in Mexico starting from 1910 was that there wasn't really a stable government or one leader that was in power. There was a series of leaders that would kind of alternate getting power, losing power, and it was just a bunch of leaders trying to all vying for that power spot. One of these leaders would be Pancho Villa, and he was planning his own rebellion, and he was actually endorsed for a very quick time by the U.S. However, the U.S. quickly abandoned him, and he was furious at Wilson and in America in general for abandoning his support. So what he did was he killed dozens of Americans, including Americans both in the Mexican border and in the United States, in like states like Texas. And so what America did was we sent General John Pershing to cross over to Mexico and capture Pancho Villa, but Pancho Villa escaped and we were never able to capture Pancho Villa. And normally in a situation like this, we send more forces, more reinforcements, more effort to capture this Pancho Villa. But Mexico quickly became an afterthought to what happens next, which is World War I. And also, if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat right now. Alright, so the road to war, we have two alliances that form. The Allied powers, which consist of Britain, France, and Russia, and we also have Central powers, which consist of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. So when talking about the causes of World War I like to look at the long-term causes first, because a war this global and significant did not happen overnight, and it was actually the cause of many long-term causes. And an acronym my teacher always told me to use to remember this is the four main causes of World War I, MAIN. So the M stands for militarism, and with all of the militaries in these major nations growing, inevitably war was going to occur. And we have A, which stands for alliances, and with conflicting alliances occurring, there would also be war that happens as alliances want what's best for their alliance and want to overcome their rivaling alliances, which is what we see here between the Allied powers and the Central powers. Then we have I, which stands for imperialism. Imperialism is the drive by many nations to expand and kind of build what's best for their country. And finally, we have N, which stands for nationalism. And nationalism is just the pride that one nation has for themselves, which definitely leads to war and conflict as the nation wants what's best for themselves. But when talking about the one short-term cause, the one immediate effect of World War I, most people would say it is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was killed on June 28, 1914. And they are absolutely correct. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand led to a series of chilling events that ultimately culminated into World War I. Okay, so let's talk about America's road to war. So at first, President Wilson, along with most of the population, urged for neutrality. We really didn't want to get involved. There was no reason for us to get involved in the war. However, because we did trade significantly with Britain and France, who were all part of the Allied powers, we really weren't neutral in a sense. Although we never declared war, because we kind of picked one side over the other. It really goes against the whole notion of us being neutral. One thing that definitely brings America to getting involved is Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, which is just the sinking of ships in their borders without warning. So here we see Germany's sinking all enemy ships, and one thing that definitely triggered the Americans to get involved was the sinking of the Lusitania, where 128 Americans were killed. Then we have the Sussex, which is a French ship sank by Germany, and this ultimately leads to the Sussex Pledge. And in this pledge, Germany pledges to not sink ships without a warning first, which they break pretty soon. And then we have the presidential election of 1916, where the Democrats pushed for re-election of Woodrow Wilson under the slogan "He kept us out of war." Like I said, Wilson urged neutrality, and as did most of the population. So by saying he kept us out of war, it definitely helped Woodrow Wilson getting elected. However, within a year, this slogan doesn't really maintain as true anymore because Woodrow Wilson inevitably was forced to go into war. Then we have another event that brings America closer to war, which is the Zimmerman telegram. Basically, in this telegram that was intercepted, we saw Germany urging Mexico to attack the United States, and in return, Mexico would get land back from the U.S. So these are 3 states in the light green that Mexico lost to the U.S., and pretty much Germany is kind of bribing Mexico, saying that if you do this for us, we'll give you these states back. So the note, along with Germany reinstituting unrestricted submarine warfare, all culminated into bringing the United States into the war. So in April 2nd, 1917, Wilson finally declares war. And that is how America gets involved in World War I. So what are the lasting impacts of World War I? We have Russia withdrawing in 1918, a few months before the war ended, and they have to give up significant amounts of land, which actually ends up playing a part later on in history. During the war, we have a national draft instituted for the first time since the Civil War, and when it was instituted during the Civil War, it was terrible. There were draft riots going on, and it's better during the Great War, but still there have been many race riots and things happening as well. But anyway, there were 3 million men drafted, 2 million volunteered, which adds up to 5 million in the American Expeditionary Force, or the AEF. Women could enlist in the war, although not in combat roles, so it'd be more like medical. 400,000 African Americans enlisted, and African Americans were actually pro-war because they were looking to improve their status, and they thought going into war would help gain rights. For the actual war itself, we have something called trench warfare, and pretty much this is a map of what a battlefield would look like in World War I, and all of this in white and like all these lines drawn out. These are the trenches. You can see like the trenches here and here. They would be opposing sides. And this area here, without the lines drawn out, that was called no man's land, and you would not want to go in there because you get bombed and blasted by sides from both sides, from your enemy and your own. World War I was unique for seeing the first use of poisonous gas and flamethrowers. And there was definitely high casualty rates with the higher weaponry, but also later into the war, many people were dying from influenza. Okay. So, how did the war affect American society? So first of all, how is war financed? Obviously, going into war is something that is very expensive. Liberty bonds were purchased, which are pretty much bonds that people can buy or invest in to help finance the war. And also the income taxes, which was put in only a few years prior to the war by the 16th Amendment during the Progressive Era, which we talked about last time. One man who definitely gained popularity was Herbert Hoover. He relied on volunteering and encouraged people to ration in order to help the war effort. And then we saw the creation of the National War Labor Board, where it was created to resolve labor disputes. And then we have unions. We have the IWW, which we talked about last time, the Industrial Workers of the World. And like we said last time, they were nicknamed I Won't Work by critics, and they would sabotage factories. And we also have the AFL, who were led by Samuel Gompers, and they were actually pro-war. So yeah, membership for this union increases. Then we have something called the Great Migration, which was the mass movement of African Americans from the South to the industrial cities in the North, such as New York City, Chicago, or Cleveland. And this was happening because during the war, many of the working men would be enlisted in the war, and they'd be overseas. So while they were fighting, the workforce actually opened up for these African Americans to take the jobs. And as these races began to mix, we have something called the Red Summer, which I'll kind of talk about more in detail later. But basically, these are just race riots of 1919. Okay, so then we have the Committee on Public Information. This is all during the war, by the way. And we have a very important man named George Creel, and he was spreading pro-war material, kind of getting America into that pro-war fever. He and his crew were nicknamed the 4-Minute Men because they would give speeches that lasted 4 minutes that would kind of rile up Americans to either join the war or become pro-war at least. He promoted the self-censorship of journalists, so he would encourage journalists to kind of censor themselves in order to increase pro-war sentiments. Then we have something called the Espionage Act of 1917, and this is kind of the beginning of a series of acts and court cases that would limit American rights in favor of pro-war. We had the prosecution of anti-war individuals, and what happened was many people were saying that prosecuting or arresting anti-war people who were against the war was against the First Amendment, which gives you the freedom of speech. So that was the argument in Schenck versus U.S., which is a Supreme Court case. However, the court said that the Espionage Act of 1917 was actually constitutional, and the argument they gave was that in a theater, you wouldn't be able to just scream fire because you'd be putting a lot of people in danger. So you can't scream fire in a crowded theater and argue your rights for freedom of speech. In a similar manner, you can't be anti-war because that would be putting other people in danger during a time of crisis. So that was a court decision by Schenck versus U.S. in 1919. Then we have Eugene V. Debs, who is convicted and sentenced to 10 years under this Espionage Act. He's definitely the most famous person who was convicted under the act. Then we have a follow-up to the Espionage Act, which is the Sedition Act of 1918. And this strengthened the Espionage Act, and it kind of expanded it, where it restricted free speech and ability to criticize government. And immigrants were definitely targeted, especially German Americans, as you might be able to imagine. So after the war has ended, we have kind of a bunch of different groups trying to strive towards what would be next, like what would happen. And President Woodrow Wilson, advocated his 14 points, which would call for self-determination, no alliances, and freedom of the seas, along with other points. And he pretty much wanted to get rid of all the things that caused the war, like the long-term causes, with the main causes: militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. And he thought the 14 points would get rid of any of that before another war could start. And something he definitely advocated for was the League of Nations, which is pretty much like the present-day UN. And what it was is a world organization committed to solving disputes. So people would, other nations would talk about disputes before going to war over it. However, the U.S. Senate disliked a clause part of the League of Nations, which was Article 10, and this clause called for members to give assistance to others if needed. And a lot of people didn't like that because not only would it take away Congress's powers to declare war, but most people wanted to stay an isolationist country. They didn't want to get involved where it wouldn't really benefit them. Then we have the Russian Civil War, which is kind of a battle between the Reds versus the Whites. And the Reds refers to the communists. And President Wilson and America definitely supports the Whites, and we're anti-communist. And the Soviet Union, which is a communist regime, was not recognized by the U.S. until 1933, which definitely reveals how anti-communist the U.S. was. And ultimately, the treaty was not ratified, as Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a Republican senator, he definitely pushed hard against the treaty. He wrote his 14 reservations, or his 14 responses to President Wilson's 14 points. And not only him, but many senators also detested the infamous Article 10. So Wilson went on a speaking tour across the country to kind of garner support for his treaty. However, this did not work. As I said, ultimately the Senate never ratifies this treaty. Okay. So in 1919 to 1920, we do see a post-war recession. The economy was definitely booming during the war because industries were booming with war products. And this is actually definitely a trend that we see, where war is able to save America from recessions. We definitely do see this in World War II, where it saves America from the Great Depression. But without digressing too much, basically after the war, there was a recession, and 1919 is commonly known as the year of strikes because, especially due to this recession, there would be many strikes going on with unions. And strikes were associated with radicalism, so they were really looked down upon by the American citizens. And a Massachusetts governor named Calvin Coolidge, who later becomes president, he was very critical of strikes, and that gained him popularity. And we said before that African Americans were pro-war because they thought that going to war would gain rights for them. However, we see that they did not gain any rights after the war. In fact, there were certain celebratory parades in Europe which celebrated the end of the World War I, and African Americans were actually banned from attending. Then we have the Red Summer. We briefly talked about this before, but I just want to say, don't confuse this with communism. When we see the term red, we usually associate that with communism, and it does, but not this. This has nothing to do with communism, but rather these are race riots that occurred during 1919 as races began to assimilate with each other. And although this happened nationwide, in Chicago there was definitely an infamous race riot that happened. Then we have this African American man named Marcus Garvey. He promoted black nationalism in a pretty controversial way. He created the United Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, and he supported that African Americans move back to Africa. And then we have the Red Scare of 1919 to 1920. This was the first Red Scare of two. And this is pretty much a crusade led by Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, who he would just crusade against anyone he thought were suspected communists, and thousands of Americans were arrested. And it is pretty evident that a lot of these Americans weren't affiliated with communism, but it was just all of this anti-communist hysteria that resulted in them becoming arrested. Then we have the infamous case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants who were anarchists, atheists, draft dodgers, which is definitely an unpopular combination, but they were charged with murder and found guilty and were executed. Now, there's definitely controversy that stems from this case, and people argue whether these guys were actually guilty of their crimes or their convictions was just a result of nativism. And so, yeah, this definitely showed tensions between immigrants and nativists and showed like this anti-immigrant sentiment. And then finally, we have the election of 1920, which I'll just touch briefly today, and we'll get more in detail on Wednesday. And this was a push to return to normalcy. Obviously, the war definitely put Americans off track and people were not used to it. So what they wanted was just to go back to what society was like before World War I ever happened. And this is pretty hard to achieve, as you might imagine. But anyway, that's it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel. Definitely help spread the word if you thought that was helpful. And I'll be here on Wednesday. If you have any questions or comments, you could ask them now. Or if you missed the video and you're watching it later on, then you could just privately message the channel. But without further ado, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you on Wednesday.